The world we once knew is gone. The certainties that defined the West for 3/4 of a century have evaporated. For decades, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was the bedrock of European security. It was a simple promise. An attack on one member was an attack on all. This promise, underwritten by the immense power of the United States, kept the peace. It allowed Europe to rebuild from the ashes of war and flourish into a prosperous, democratic union. The American nuclear umbrella was a given. The presence of American troops on European soil was a constant. This was the architecture of our world, a structure we took for granted. Now, that structure is crumbling. The election of Donald Trump to a second term in November 2024 did not cause this shift, but it accelerated it with breathtaking speed. The old assumptions no longer hold. The transatlantic relationship, once a partnership of shared values and interests, has become transactional and deeply uncertain. The language of diplomacy has been replaced by the language of the ledger book. The conversations in Brussels and Berlin are no longer about shared destiny. They are about contingency plans. They are about what happens when the American shield is lowered or removed entirely. This is a profound and unsettling change. This new reality forces Europe to confront questions it has long avoided. For 75 years, the continent outsourced a significant portion of its security to Washington. This arrangement was comfortable. It was affordable. It allowed European nations to invest in generous social welfare states instead of massive armies. But that era is definitively over. The shift is not just a policy change, it is a psychological one. It demands a new mindset from leaders and citizens alike. The comfortable reliance on a distant protector is being replaced by the harsh necessity of self-reliance. The implications are enormous, touching everything from national budgets to the very identity of the European project. Today, in June 2025, the continent is at a crossroads. The path forward is not clear. The old road, the one paved with American assurances, is closed. A new one must be built, and it must be built quickly. The shadow of a resurgent and aggressive Russia looms to the east, its war against Ukraine a brutal reminder of what is at stake. The very idea of a Europe whole, free, and at peace is under threat in a way it has not been since the darkest days of the Cold War. The story of our time is the story of Europe's scramble to adapt to this dangerous new world, to forge a new strength from the fragments of the old alliance. The American security guarantee was never just about military hardware. It was a state of mind. It was the belief held deeply on both sides of the Atlantic that American and European security were indivisible. This belief was forged in the fires of 2 world wars and solidified during the long twilight struggle of the Cold War. The United States saw a strong, stable Europe as a vital national interest. It was a bulwark against Soviet expansionism. It was a community of democratic partners. The commitment was not charity. It was a strategic calculation rooted in a shared vision of a liberal world order. Generations of American presidents, both Republican and Democrat, upheld this consensus. That consensus is now dead. The questioning of America's role did not begin with Donald Trump, but he gave it a powerful, populist voice. A growing number of Americans began to see the commitment to Europe differently. They saw it not as a strategic asset, but as a costly burden. They asked why American taxpayers should fund the defense of wealthy European nations. They saw allies who, in their view, were not paying their fair share. This sentiment resonated in a country weary of foreign entanglements and focused on domestic problems. The idea of America First was not just a slogan, it was a fundamental reordering of national priorities. This shift in American thinking created a deep sense of unease in European capitals long before the 2024 election. Leaders watched as the American political debate changed. They heard the rising chorus of voices questioning the value of old alliances. They saw the focus of American foreign policy pivot towards Asia and the challenge of China. Europe, once the central theater of American grand strategy, began to feel like a secondary concern. The reliability of the United States, once an article of faith, became a subject of anxious debate. The foundation was cracking long before the earthquake hit. President Trump's second administration has turned these anxieties into a stark reality. He has made it explicit that the United States no longer sees European security as its own. The commitment is now conditional. It is contingent on financial contributions. It is subject to the whims of a president who views alliances as protection rackets. The core principle of NATO, Article 5, which guarantees collective defense, is no longer seen as a sacred vow. It is seen as a transaction. This change has sent a shockwave through the continent, forcing every European nation to re-evaluate its most basic assumptions about its own security and survival. President Trump's approach to NATO is simple and direct. He views it as a business deal, and one in which America has been getting a raw deal for decades. His central message has been consistent. European countries must pay more for their own defense. This is what he calls burden sharing. The concept itself is not new. For years, NATO members have agreed to a guideline of spending at least 2% of their gross domestic product on defense. For a long time, most European nations failed to meet this target. They relied on the United States to fill the gap. Trump has transformed this long-standing debate into a non-negotiable ultimatum. His actions have been as blunt as his words. Since taking office in January 2025, his administration has conducted a public and often hostile audit of Allied defense spending. He has praised countries that meet or exceed the 2% target and publicly shamed those that do not. He has threatened to downgrade security cooperation with nations he deems delinquent. The message is clear. The days of America providing security for free are over. If you want American protection, you must pay for it. This transactional approach has stripped the alliance of its foundation of shared values and replaced it with a cold, hard calculation of costs and benefits. This doctrine was on full display at the recent NATO summit in The Hague. It was an event unlike any other in the alliance's history. The traditional language of solidarity and unity was absent. Instead, the proceedings were dominated by President Trump's demands for payment. He reportedly presented a plan that would reclassify NATO's security guarantees into tiers. Countries spending over 2% of GDP would receive the full benefits of Article 5. Those spending less would receive a reduced level of support, or perhaps none at all. The idea that an American president would pick and choose which allies to defend has shattered the very essence of the alliance. The impact of this approach cannot be overstated. It has introduced a profound level of instability and distrust into what was once the world's most successful military alliance. Allies now look at each other with suspicion. They wonder who will be defended and who will be abandoned. The principle of all for one and one for all has been replaced by every nation for itself. Trump's doctrine has effectively broken the central promise of NATO. He has told Europe that it is on its own. The continent has heard the message loud and clear and is now beginning to act accordingly. The shock of the Trump doctrine has finally galvanized Europe into action. For years, calls for greater European strategic autonomy were mostly talk. They were debated in academic seminars and mentioned in communiques, but they rarely led to significant change. The comfortable reality of the American security blanket always won out. Now, with that blanket being pulled away, the abstract concept of European defense has become an urgent necessity. The change is visible across the continent, from the corridors of power in Brussels to the factory floors of the defense industry. The awakening has been rude, but it is real. Germany, long a reluctant military power, is undergoing a historic transformation. Chancellor Friedrich Merz's government has pushed through a massive increase in the defense budget, finally and decisively exceeding the 2% NATO target. Berlin has launched ambitious procurement programs for new tanks, fighter jets, and air defense systems. More profoundly, the public debate in Germany has shifted. The deep-seated post-war pacifism is giving way to a new realism. There is a growing understanding that peace and security can no longer be outsourced. Germany is beginning to accept its role as a central pillar of European security, a responsibility it has shirked for decades. France, which has always maintained a more independent defense posture, is pushing for an even more radical vision. President Macron is championing the idea of a European Security Council and a fully integrated European command structure. He argues that Europe must develop its own nuclear deterrent, a concept that remains controversial but is gaining traction. Paris is leading efforts to pool military resources, coordinate weapons development, and create a rapid reaction force capable of operating without American assistance. The French goal is clear: to build a Europe that is a power in its own right. not merely a collection of American protectorates. The United Kingdom, now outside the European Union, finds itself in a complex position. While still seeking a special relationship with Washington, London recognizes the shifting landscape. The British government has increased its own defense spending and is deepening bilateral security ties with key European partners, particularly France and Poland. The EU itself is also stepping up. The European Commission has launched a European Defence Fund to finance joint research and procurement. There is talk of issuing common Eurobonds to fund a massive continent-wide rearmament program. The pieces are moving on the chessboard. Europe is slowly, painfully, but surely starting to build its own fortress. The NATO summit in The Hague in May 2025 will be remembered as the moment the old alliance officially died. It was not a collapse in a hail of angry rhetoric, but something more chilling, a formal acknowledgement of a new, colder reality. The summit's final communiqué was a masterpiece of diplomatic ambiguity, but its meaning was unmistakable. The unconditional, automatic nature of Article 5 was gone. The alliance was being restructured along the transactional lines demanded by President Trump. The unity that had been NATO's greatest strength was replaced by a tiered system of commitment, a hierarchy of the protected and the exposed. The debates behind closed doors were reportedly brutal. Leaders from Eastern European countries, particularly Poland and the Baltic states, pleaded for a reaffirmation of the ironclad security guarantee. They are on the front line facing a hostile Russia, and they see the American commitment as existential. They argued that any ambiguity would be an invitation for Russian aggression. In contrast, President Trump and his aides were unyielding. They presented charts and figures, treating the alliance like a failing business in need of a ruthless restructuring. The traditional allies, such as Germany and France, were caught in the middle, trying to salvage what they could of the old framework, while accepting the new reality. The public statements were carefully managed, but the tension was palpable. President Trump declared the summit a historic success. He claimed to have secured billions in new defense spending from delinquent allies. He presented the new conditional structure as a fairer and more sustainable model for the 21st century. European leaders offered a different narrative. They spoke of European responsibility and the need to strengthen the European pillar of the alliance. They tried to frame the outcome not as an abandonment by the United States, but as a coming of age for Europe. But no one was fooled. It was a divorce, negotiated in public. The most significant outcome of The Hague was not written in the final communique. It was the unspoken understanding reached among the European leaders. They left the summit knowing, with absolute certainty, that they could no longer rely on the United States for their ultimate security. The debates were no longer about how to persuade Washington to stay. They were about how to survive without it. The summit marked the end of a long and difficult conversation and the beginning of a frantic and dangerous race against time. Europe had to build its own defense, and it had to do it now. The question hanging over Europe is stark: can it defend itself? The answer is complex and uncertain. On paper, the combined economic and demographic power of the European Union dwarfs that of Russia. The combined defense spending of European NATO members, if properly coordinated, would create a formidable military force. Europe has advanced defense industries, professional militaries, and 2 nuclear powers in France and the United Kingdom. The potential is there. Europe is not weak. It has simply been dormant, sheltered for decades under the American wing. The challenge is to awaken this potential and turn it into a coherent, effective fighting force. But the obstacles are immense. For 75 years, European militaries have been designed to operate as junior partners within a US-led structure. They lack crucial capabilities that America has always provided: strategic airlift satellite intelligence, aerial refueling, and sophisticated command and control systems. Building these capabilities from scratch will take years, perhaps decades, and will cost hundreds of billions of euros. Furthermore, deep political divisions remain. Will nations be willing to cede sovereignty to a unified European command? Can 27 member states, each with its own history and strategic culture, truly act as one? A Europe without the United States would have profound consequences for the global balance of power. For Ukraine, it would be a devastating blow. While European nations have provided significant aid, the sheer scale of American military support has been irreplaceable. A US withdrawal from the conflict would place immense pressure on Kiev and could embolden Moscow. For Russia, a fractured NATO and a distracted America would be a strategic dream come true. President Putin could see an opportunity to reassert Russian dominance over Eastern Europe, testing the resolve of a newly independent European defense structure before it is fully formed. The future of NATO itself is in doubt. It may evolve into a two-pillared alliance, with a European pillar standing alongside the North American one. This is the optimistic scenario. It assumes that the United States remains engaged, albeit in a reduced capacity. The pessimistic scenario is that NATO becomes a hollow shell, a political organization without a credible military deterrent. It could even collapse entirely, leaving behind a patchwork of bilateral agreements and regional coalitions. In this fragmented landscape, the risk of miscalculation and conflict would be dangerously high. Europe would be a much more dangerous place. We are living through the end of an era. The post-Cold War order, built on the foundation of American power and the Transatlantic alliance, is over. The second Trump administration has forced Europe to confront a reality it long sought to avoid: the necessity of its own defense. This is not a temporary crisis or a passing disagreement. It is a fundamental, structural shift in the geopolitical landscape. The stakes could not be higher. At risk is not just the future of an alliance, but the future of the democratic world and the stability of the European continent itself. The path toward European strategic autonomy will be long and difficult. It will require immense financial investment, political will, and a level of unity that Europe has rarely managed to achieve. It will demand that nations like Germany and France overcome their historical differences and forge a genuine strategic partnership. It will require smaller nations to trust that this new European power will protect their interests. There will be failures and setbacks. The temptation to fall back on national interests, to make separate deals, will be strong. This is the great test of the European project in the 21st century. The outcome of this test will redefine the global map. A successful, strategically sovereign Europe could emerge as a new superpower, a third pole in a world increasingly defined by US-China competition. It could be a powerful force for stability and democratic values. A Europe that fails, that remains fragmented and weak, would become a battleground for influence between other great powers. It would be a continent of permanent insecurity, haunted by the ghosts of its past conflicts. Russia would be emboldened, and the forces of illiberalism would gain ground. The world would be a more chaotic and dangerous place. Ultimately, this is a story about democracy's ability to defend itself. For decades, that defense was underwritten by the United States. That guarantee is now gone. The democracies of Europe must now learn to stand on their own feet. They must rediscover the martial virtues and the spirit of collective action that they have long neglected. They must prove that a union of free nations can generate not only prosperity, but also power. The twilight of the American-led order has descended. The question is whether Europe can build something new and durable before the darkness falls.